So welcome all of you to our 8th and final webinar of the Fundamentals of Restorative Justice series hosted by the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. I am Aparna Pulavarpu, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of SCRJI, as well as an Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. So the usual reminders, you are able to chat with panelists only. Chat is being monitored by my colleague Torres for tech support. He's ensuring that the technology runs smoothly. Other attendees cannot see this chat, and panelists will not be reading the chat. If you have questions, please post them to the Q&A, and you can see the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen if you would like me, the moderator, to see it. South Carolina bar members seeking CLE credit, please keep an eye on the chat. You will be prompted every 15 minutes to submit your SC bar number. You must do this so we can certify your continued presence in this webinar to the Commission on CLE. As always, we have our 2 sign interpreters, and we also have live captioning. To access live captioning, please click on the CC icon on your Zoom screen. So today I am very excited to welcome our speaker, David Hooker, who is a professor of practice of conflict transformation and peace building at Notre Dame. And he will be speaking to us today about transformative community conferencing. And I don't want to take any more time away from David, so I'm going to turn it right over.
Thank you. Are we recording it? Normally we do a thing. We are. Perfect. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us in this conversation. Transformative community conferencing is something that I really enjoy talking about because it has a way of bringing together a variety of the different parts of my practice and intellectual journey. And so I hope that it shows up, and I hope that we can engage in a good conversation about it. You will notice as I talk about my practice and intellectual journey, my law degree is still active. I was a practicing trial lawyer in Georgia for about a dozen years, assistant attorney general, and then had a private civil rights practice. I am ordained clergy in the United Church of Christ, and my doctoral work is in social construction. And so each of those kind of will filter in different ways to the ways that I speak about transformative community conferencing and the ways that we talk about how to engage communities, because all of those have been particularly informative for me. So let's get at it. What I wanted to do just kind of quickly is run through a description about the origins, how I came to this transformative community conferencing. I'll spend very little time, but talk about philosophical and theoretical underpinnings, particularly looking at social construction and narrative. And then we want to talk about kind of the steps in the transformative community conferencing process and what are some things to think about as you're trying to implement the process as a whole, or the kind of philosophy and the intentions of transformative community conferencing in some part in your community engagement strategies or in your legal practice. So as I think about my journey to transformative community conferencing, from the earliest years, I have been involved with a variety of different ways to try and create reconciliation and, if possible, equity in racialized, in gendered, and ethnicized spaces in the United States. And so I've been involved, well, and far beyond the United States as well. My practice has taken me well outside of the United States, where many of these same questions show up. But I've been involved with the National Coalition Building Institute, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Some of you may be familiar with the Undoing Racism workshops that the People's Institute runs. I ran those for any number of years. The Decade of Dialogue to End Racism in Mississippi. If you can imagine, we thought that we could end racism in 10 years in Mississippi with the William Winter Institute and the Kellogg Foundation. Was founding director, research director for the Coming to the Table project, the Taking America Beyond the Legacy of Enslavement, which we founded at Eastern Mennonite University when I was part of the faculty there. And the process was bringing together formerly descendants of formerly enslaved and descendants of formerly enslavers and slave traders, descendants of former slave traders, in dialogue processes that began to ask the question, what do we do other than knowing this history? What might we do to change the continuing and compounding effects that history has produced for us? I've also been involved with the Performing Greensboro project, the Greensboro Counter Stories project as well. Some of you may be familiar with that. A couple of places where some of this work uh, is recorded, acknowledged, and talked about deeper than we'll be able to go to in the webinar. The Transforming Historical Harms Manual. This manual is actually now open access, and so if you just go to whatever your web search engine is, and you put in Transforming Historical Harms, or you put some portion of my name in Transforming Historical Harms, the entire manual is free and available for download at this point. There's also another piece that's available called Performing Greensboro, when we go more deeply into it and talk at the deep theoretical level about how this transformative community conferencing emerged. For some of you, that may be fascinating. So hopefully you would be interested in looking into that as well. But really quickly, and I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this as I would in a different setting, the theoretical framework for much of our work is in the idea of social construction, which has several principles. These principles become important. I know they just sound like theory, but they really are important for how we think about transforming communities. So knowledge is sustained through social processes. What we know and what we act on and what we treat as reality is reinforced, is sustained through our social engagement and our social performance in community. We do not believe that people exist with an essential nature, but that they are formed by their constant interactions with their society, with their family, with their culture, with their community, in their work. Knowledge is a reflection of perception, and very few of us have the capacity to actually directly represent what is real. We always are making meaning. And language becomes really important for our work. We think that while there are truths that are available, that there are very few things that would be inherently true. Like, it's true because we organize our lives around it, and not because the meaning that we make is the only truth that there is. I also add into this social construction framework the idea that traumagenic circumstances and events impact our meaning-making process, and that narratives that we tell and narratives that we organize our lives around frame structures, policies, procedures, relationships. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But narratives shape our relationship with our community and culture. So this is, for most of us, when we're thinking about transforming communities, we're thinking about transforming what I would call historical harms. What those historical harms are the compounding advantages and disadvantages that emerged over time as the result of and in reaction to historically traumagenic events or context. We have historically traumagenic events or context, we make meaning of those, we embed those in stories and structures, and then there's always some resistance to it. There are dominant narratives and resistance. And overall, that's what's producing the continuation of what we would talk about today as historical harms. And so those historical harms are the things that we are trying to transform. The inequities in healthcare, in education, in economics, in the justice system, in just living, are often having their origins in events and contexts that are decades, centuries, generations old. And this transformative community conferencing also is informed by my understanding of trauma. And we won't spend a tremendous amount of time talking about it, but please know that trauma shapes how we think about the world, how we see the world, how we interpret and relate to systems. Trauma shapes how systems are shaped, how policies and practices are shaped. Trauma determines who is believed and who is not believed, who has what we call testimonial authority. And so all of that is part of this cultural mix that we are now seeking to transform towards a more just and equitable society. And those historical traumas, the legacy and aftermath. Legacy, just really quickly, is history, folklore, mythology, lies, the narratives that get passed down to us. Aftermath are the structural rubble from previously traumagenic circumstances. And so the policies, procedures, laws, rules, systemic, economic setups are all what we would consider aftermath. And legacy and aftermath combine and continually interact with each other to perform, to produce, to create and sustain the societies, the cultures and communities that we are experiencing on a regular basis. So we think about legacy and aftermath as part of what we are seeking to transform when we're transforming through the use of community conferencing processes. What's important to know or to recognize is that transforming social systems, resulting in the redistribution of social power, and we have to transform cultural narratives. In order to transform social systems, we have to transform societal and cultural narratives. That's the nature of the work. And that's the purpose and the intention of the transformative community conferencing process. So let me just do this. I'm breezing through this. You may want to have some questions about it, which we can certainly wrestle with, but I'm running through this a bit more quickly than I might so that we can get to process work. But there's a difference between stories and narratives. When I was finishing writing the Transforming Historical Harms manual, I had been using the language of narratives, but I really had only been talking about stories. And near the end of that work, I got to understand the important distinction between stories and narratives, which is why I went back to revise the work in the Performing Greensboro Transformative Community Conferencing Manual to think more about the distinction between stories and narratives. So a story, most of us recognize stories. They have different genres, they have different contexts in which they are told, but they basically are a sequence of events generally situated in the past, and they have certain rhetorical or ideological purposes for which they're told. Fairy tales have an ideological purpose. Fiction, history, news all have particular rhetorical and ideological purposes, and so they have a structural integrity about the way that they're told. There's an arc to a story in the way that it's told. So you can distinguish between a story and just a list of events that happen. Narrative, what narratives do is give a context to or connect many stories. So the narrative framing makes several stories, several different smaller accounts. It connects them in ways that gives them meaning. We'll talk about that. Let me say a little bit more about that. But narrative is a way so that you can tell multiple stories that all fit inside of a particular narrative. Let me give you just one quick example. If you have a friend or family member who lives in what we would describe as a victim's narrative, They can have many stories, but all of those stories ultimately point back to how they are being victimized or how they have been historically victimized. And so the narrative framing allows them to make sense of all of the different data and observations that they're making. Sometimes we can't make the same meaning as they can, or we don't recognize and identify the same we don't make the same observations as they do, but they make the observations that fit inside of and connect to that particular narrative. Well, that's one that we can kind of point out, but all of us live inside of narrative structures. And most of the narratives that we have were narratives that were given to us. And so we don't really question the way that those narratives are held together. We just tell our stories in alignment with narratives. And transformative community conferencing is designed to deconstruct those stories in ways that unveil or reveal the narratives, because it's the narratives that have to be shifted in order to shift the culture or community. And then master narratives are the ones that we're really familiar with. These are the ones that cross over time. We say they're transhistorical, which means that they cross over time and they're deeply embedded in a particular culture. And so if I said something like The Little Engine That Could, or The Boy That Cried Wolf, or Little Red Riding Hood, these are transhistorical narratives in the sense that multiple generations will know the structure of that story, and then you can just add in the current observations, like what's happening today that fits inside of a Boy Who Cried Wolf narrative. Some of these narratives are also archetypes. The wizard, the cowboy, the damsel in distress, all of those are transhistorical narratives that become deeply embedded in a particular culture. And every culture has different ones. We sometimes have the same ones, but we also have some that are different and unique to our culture. But those narratives shape how we think about life, how we think about the decisions, the relationships that we make. So stories are connected together by narratives, and those stories and those narratives actually get embedded in every other part of our system. So narratives shape the way that families interact, the way that school is organized, the way that our peer groups and our neighborhoods are set up, and the way that the legal system is set up. There are narratives that shape these kinds of things. And so the relationship between the value of property and people, the prioritizing between the value of people and property is embedded in certain narratives, and those narratives then shape our legal structure. They shape how mass media tells stories. It shapes the structure of our family and friends and our neighborhoods. So I'll give you a quick example of narrative that's really prevalent right now. The narrative, the idea that what makes a young person successful is they grow up, they get a profession or a calling or a work craft that they can become self-sustaining, and they go out and buy their own house. So having your own house is successful in certain narratives, which then means during a pandemic or during global downturn, when people are moving in with their families, or you hear these news reports from time to time about children who never moved out, they're still living with their parents. And that's a particular cultural narrative, because in many cultures, it is the case that living with your parents and grandparents, 3 and 4 generation households together, is a proper and right thing to do. And so it's a cultural narrative, but that cultural narrative also infuses our economic models and everything like that. So this is just to say that narratives are infused with social power. If we're trying to change the structure, the organization, particularly inequitable arrangements in society, we have to attend to the narratives. And that's the purpose of the transformative community conferencing process, is to attend to, identify, and then transform the narratives that shape our society. If we think of narratives in this way as having this kind of force and power, then we understand what Peter Block says when he says that community is fundamentally, he says human, but I would say all life, community is fundamentally an interdependent, all life system given its form by the conversations it holds with itself. And so the history, the buildings, the economy, infrastructure, everything are embedded in the narratives and the conversations that we hold with ourselves. Similarly, Monk and Winsley talk about culture as best thought of in terms of practices. So our culture is based on practices that are held in place by narratives. And those narratives are embedded with lines of force and power. So narratives hold within them social hierarchies and social inequity. If we're trying to change the inequity, we can't just change the organizing features of the system. We have to change the organizing logic in which those systems exist, which is the intention and the structure and the emphasis of transformative community conferencing. So I actually could talk a lot about identity narratives, but I want to talk about one aspect of identity. I skipped a bit, but I want to talk about one aspect of identity which helps us to think about why and how transformative community conferencing works. Everyone all the time exists with multiple social identities. Some of those identities are shaped by our ethnicity, race, gender, affectional preference, nationality, religion, diet, regional identity. Those are kind of politically, socially constructed, socially defined, and often those are assigned characteristics. Those aren't necessarily characteristics that you've chosen or that you have any agency inside of. They are assigned to you, or they exist by virtue of the nature of your birth. We believe that, on the other hand, there are roles that people take on, some of which are chosen and flexible. You can choose whether to be you can choose whether to be married. So you're born into a family. That one's not chosen, but you can be flexible in the nature of that relationship. But you can choose whether to be married. You can choose how and if to be employed, and what you do in terms of your community engagement or involvement and hobbies, and what knowledge you acquire and assets you possess. But in many societies, the roles that you take on are equally trauma informed, as are the social identities. And so if you were a teacher, for instance, in a community where at the time of desegregation, all of the Black schools were closed and Black children were required to integrate into other schools, then your identity as teacher is politically charged, or your identity as Black principal is politically charged. And so it's not just that roles are not politically charged, they are equally imbued with power, embedded with power, and there are certain ways to do the roles. And so the narratives that describe how those roles are done also are infused with and embedded with certain power. So particularly on this call, lawyers are often given this narrative of having a significant amount of knowledge and capacities, and often far beyond what is worthy of what we actually know. The reason I actually decided to go to law school was just so I could get paid more as a mediator. And in order to decide whether I could do it, I went down to the courthouse and I realized you don't have to be the sharpest knife in a drawer to pass the bar. You do not have to be, there are a lot of 40-watt bulbs. Tell the truth, there are a lot of 40-watt bulbs. Not everybody's a 100-watt bulb practicing law, but we're given a lot more authority and power, and our roles are expanded much further than maybe our training merits. But anyway, our identities and our roles are always present. It's just that in different contexts, certain ones of them are more salient. So your community social identities, your role identities, your public and private persona, and the macro and meta narratives that shape who you are always present. It's just the context of the circumstance is decisive as to which among those is the most important. You're always, whatever roles you take on, whatever race, religion, gender, age, family, relationship you have, you're always in those. It's just that the context decides how those get performed at any given moment. And so you have to be able to talk in fairly nuanced ways with people in community to understand how community is shaping their existence and how they are responding to community. So I think of it as kind of a valence, like all of these identities are always present, and they are the salience and significance of the different identity categories is decided or decisive of the context, or the context is decisive of which of those is meaningful. And all of that plays into how we have conversations about uh, the shaping and reshaping of community. So we have these personal stories that help to shape our sense of identity. Those personal stories are formed and infused with certain narrative and discourse, which have power in them, and that determines our sense of belonging or exclusion or othering in a particular community context. So let's talk quickly, since this is the only thing we're supposed to be talking about. I'm about to get the time sign. Let's talk quickly about the steps of transformative community conferencing. Um, transformative community conferencing is different from restorative justice. You all have talked about restorative justice. You've talked about transformative justice. And so this is important. It's different from restorative and transformative justice the way you've heard about it, in the sense that restorative justice operates within a set of accepted rules and bounds and laws. And when harm has been done, we try to reestablish the order. We try to reestablish right relationship within those rules, within the current order system in the school, in the law, and things like that. Transformative community conferencing allows for the possibility that we have to change the order of things, that the structure itself might be the source of the harm. Transformative justice kind of points towards that. Most of the time when we talk about transformative justice in our context, it's in the context of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and the way in which Mimi Kim, Miriam Kaba, some of these other folks have talked about how communities get to organize and emphasize their values, which is an important part of transformative community conferencing. But it's not about holding people to account for a particular wrongdoing as much as it is about narrating a preferred future that we can all live into. So it's renegotiating we the people and what we as a community are willing to hold as our values, because then we set up the rules, the relationships, the resources, the structures that affirm the values and the narrative that we ourselves have committed to. So transformative community conferencing has a different intention. It has different processes. It involves community differently than, say, restorative justice. And conferencing is distinctly different from circles and dialogue processes. And importantly, we have a different way of listening. We listen to problematics and not for problems. And we listen with what we call double listening, deconstructive listening, listening for the absent but implicit in the way that people talk about their experience in community. We remember that power is embedded in identity narratives. And so when we're talking in transformative community conferencing, we are trying to identify the impact that power has and the impact that those narratives have on shaping the experience of different people within the community. And so these are really quickly the steps of transformative community conferencing. The important part, externalizing the conversation. How do you externalize and then map the problematic, share stories about problematic existence to deepen our relationship with one another? How do we reverse map, choose a preferred narrative, and then build a transformative action agenda? So externalizing conversation always begins with this assertion. Some people resist this assertion, but we always start with this assertion. The people are not the problem. The problem is the problem. How do we name the problem? We need people. If everybody, this is one of the differences between some of the other models of dialogue and engagement. Nobody has to be wrong to initially, has to accept somehow that they are wrong or fatally flawed in order to participate in this conversation. It may well be that your reaction to a problematic in community is itself problematic, but we're trying to identify what the problematics are to allow people to engage directly with the problematics, even if their behavior, even if their reaction to that problematic is ultimately compounding problems for others. We want to be able to notice that, but not make the people wrong for it as an initial matter. We want people to be able to be engaged and to identify together what the problematic looks like. So if people aren't the problem is the problem. And in order to do this, we usually start by practicing with a third thing, something like a piece of theater, a movie, a song, a piece of poetry, or sometimes scripture, a fairy tale, or a piece of art. And we have people talk about what they see in there, first to map the problematic, first to practice it before we start mapping community. You want people to see that there is power in this mapping before they actually try to take on their own theater, which community is theater. Before they take on their own theater, how do they look at somebody else's? So imagine we're all sitting side by side, we're seeing a theater performance, and we're trying to do an analysis of it. What do we see? What are the problematics? How are people reacting to those problematics? Because we're all seeing it, there's a non-judgmental way in which we can differ on what we understand and the meaning, the different meanings that we're making, because we're all just looking at something like a play or like a movie. It's not something that we have agency over. We didn't write the script, we didn't act out the movie, and so we can look at this non-judgmentally together, even though we come from very different perspectives. The truth is, though, you can't see a movie, a play, you can't read a scripture or hear a song or look at a piece of art without reflecting your own experience. Every piece of your meaning making is based from the trajectory of your identity, from your positionality. And so even as we're using this third thing, we're already beginning to see how people are experiencing and making meaning differently. After we've done it with the third thing, we do it with the community itself. And so we try to divine what are the problematics in this community. And this is back in the day when people actually could have meetings where they could be together in a room, and you didn't have to be socially distanced and things like that. We might produce something that looks like this, where inside the circle are some of the central problematics, and then outside are some of what's being produced. I'm going to show you what this reads like in a second. This is just a visual of what it looks like. If you draw a circle in the middle, you put the problematics and then what they're producing. You get a sense of how the community is being experienced. So everybody has their own interpretation and meaning making. And then we stop and we share stories about what this looks like. If the problematic includes things like fear and apathy and separation and misinformation, then we would, in small groups, breakout rooms, or small circles, tell stories about how, in the face of fear, I respond this way. In the face of fear and apathy and misinformation, I've seen this done. I've not done this. I've chosen to shop here. I won't let my children play there. I choose to live here. So we're starting to see what community looks like in response to those problematics. After we've mapped the problematic, though, we also notice that the problem and dominant narrative isn't the only way to think about community. There are always unique, special outcomes that happen. And so we do reverse mapping. We say everything bad isn't bad in this community. What else is happening? And people will identify what positive things are happening. And then we ask them in a reverse mapping way, what makes that possible? What's present? What are the values? What are the systems? What are the qualities that make that unique outcome possible? And we share stories about that as well. So you You map the problematic and see what it produces, and then you see what else is out there and go the reverse way. So we reverse map that. I just want to give you an example. In one town, this was an example of a dominant narrative that they identified. They said that in this town, in this community, there's fear, mistrust, possibly some ignorance. There is duplicitousness around the progressive mystique. If you confront the mystique, there's pushback, whole power structure that seeks to preserve its image as a progressive city. Then there's weariness among the activists. The mistrust and fear produce separation. People work in silos. People rarely work together. There's ineffective communication. As a result, there's a lack of a good vocabulary to even talk about the issues. And so there's a continuing misunderstanding that says to some people, you're actually less than me. For other groups, there seems to be an intentional silencing or invisibility. And this has something of an anti-aspirational atmosphere. We don't want to be any better. This was a dominant narrative that is produced from that chart that I showed you. This is kind of what, this is a prose way of saying exactly what they had, that they had mapped as a dominant narrative. But then you ask the same group, this can't possibly be all that there is in the community. And so this is what they also said. This is the same community. They said in this community, people take time for one another. When there's difficulty, we persevere. We create space for grace and forgiveness and vulnerability. There's leadership that allows for the creation of safe spaces where trust can be built. People who care more about friendship than they do about politics. There are many people who have not forgotten the ethic of love, and they're able to build alliances to make common good. These two stories, these two sets of narratives are happening in the same community at the same time. If you were presented with the opportunity to choose, if your community could choose between a narrative that was primarily about fear, mistrust, separation, apathy, people feeling less than me, people feeling intentionally silenced and invisibilized, or a community in which people created space for grace and forgiveness. They confronted economic barriers. People cared more about friendship than about politics, and they had not forgotten an ethic of love. Which would you choose? If you were invited to choose, which would you choose? Most people almost certainly choose this smaller counter narrative. But the reason that in transformative community conferencing you require choice is because the choice is always available. With every decision that we make, with every action, with every dollar that you spend, with every place that you frequent, places that you choose not to go, you are making a choice to support one of those narratives or the other. If you have a choice to support the counter narrative, then the question becomes, what are the relationships, resources, structures? Who needs increased testimonial authority in order for the counter narrative to become the dominant narrative of this community? How do we make that our dominant narrative? And so then that becomes your action plan. What are the necessary, what do we have to do to change the relationships, resources, structures, testimonial authority in order to make this counter narrative our dominant narrative? And you have to choose. You have, because people, if you don't recognize that there's a choice, then people don't realize that they are responsible for producing and performing and maintaining the community as it is. If you want to transform it, we all have a sense of agency in doing so, in changing it. And so how do we create the choice that then allows our chosen narrative to become the dominant or habitual narrative. The thing is, we live in narratives. And so every narrative just becomes habit. We act certain ways out of habit. We don't think through it every time, every day. We make certain decisions and they become routinized. If you want to do something new, it's awkward at first, but you have to make a choice to do something new. If you decide you're going to be in shape, you do things new. You get up early, you get better sleep, you get to the gym, you go for a walk, you eat differently. If you're eating differently, that means you shop differently. It means that you do things, you shape your relationships, your resources, the structures in support of this new narrative of who you're going to be. The same thing happens in community. We have to do that together. We name the narrative that we've chosen and then identify what are the relationships, resources, and structures, because there is always a choice. And we have to sit with that choice, because what we know is that the community that we have, to a certain extent, is the community that we were given. It's also the community that we are producing and sustaining unless we are resisting or doing otherwise. So you make a choice. And then you plan for how that choice will bear itself out in order to build a new and preferred future, a narrative of a new and preferred future. And when you've done that, at steps along the way, because narrative change is a slow process, you take time to celebrate the small and the large in terms of what you've done. When you name a new narrative, you celebrate. When you have any small victory, when you organize any small way of transforming, you celebrate. You always have to remember to celebrate, because these are long changes. These are generational changes. Narrative transformation isn't something that happens overnight. Sometimes what has to happen is not like the very first thing you do. You can't just immediately call people and say, let's do a transformative community conferencing process. You want to do certain things. You want to begin out there listening, talking, hearing, identifying issues, bringing people together who are able to facilitate small groups with you. You recruit people from all different parts of your society, from your community, to have these conferences. And then maybe you do some small community conferences before you do a large final gathering where you build together a narrative of a preferred future. Humanity 1.0 was about honoring anything that held and gave life. Humanity 1.0, we honored the divine feminine. We lived in caves. We appreciated things that gave life. But with the advent of certain technology, we were able to store. We moved from a hunter-gatherer to an agricultural, and storage then produced the possibility for greed. And greed changed from honoring the feminine divine to honoring the masculine, the warrior, those who could both gather and protect. And then we created social hierarchies as opposed to interconnected networks of people. Humanity 3.0 reflects what we're learning in quantum physics, which is that the electrons that stabilize you are the electrons that stabilize me. And the air that was breathed generations and generations ago will be breathed generations and generations from now. And so we have a responsibility while it's in our body to protect it, because it's not just ours, it's others. And so we have an integrated sense of how we move together. We are connected. There's an illusion of separation that is disintegrating, and we're recognizing both a global and a local interconnectivity. That is moving towards Humanity 3.0. That's the nature of our work, and that's the purpose of Transformative Community Conference.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions. Well, my first question actually to you was, you'd mentioned a different way of listening. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. How do we engage in that what you call double listening?
So double listening is a really important strategy. The central premise of double listening is that every complaint is also an expression of hope.
Mhm.
You only get angry or dissatisfied because you believe that something could be better. We're never surprised by the facts on the ground. We're surprised by the narrative of the way the gap between what we're observing and what we think it should be. You're never disappointed with their children for what they do. You're disappointed with their children for what you think they should have done, right? And it's the gap in between. And so when we do double listening, when somebody offers a complaint, we invite them to say not just what's problematic, but what is the thing that is the hoped for piece that's missing? What's the gap? What's absent but implicit in the way that you talk about this thing? When you say that somebody is failing to do something, we also have to believe that they have the capacity to do it, right? You don't, your child, you don't say that they failed to do something if they haven't yet acquired the knowledge or the skills to do it. But once they have, then we believe that they can disappoint us. And so we're listening for all of that in how we speak to one another. Because sometimes if we only speak to one another in terms of condemnation and deficit, we forget that what we're actually trying to say is that there's hope on the other side of that. So part of this, because these are difficult conversations, we want to make sure that people are hearing the fullness of the concern as it's expressed. And so we do double listening and we try to identify what's absent but implicit in what people are saying.
Thank you. So if I know you talked a little bit about how this looks and you gave that one example. Do you have any examples you could talk about, you know, that you've worked on or are working on that take this from the beginning? And I'm especially interested in what kind of agreements come out of this process.
Mm-hmm. So for instance, so I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, after they had done their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it had achieved certain things, but hadn't fully achieved everything that people had hoped in for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I spent about 18 months with a partner, listening, going to barbershops and going to playgrounds and going to town hall meetings and sitting in coffee shops and sitting in the bleachers at soccer fields and in art events and listening to what people were saying, and then going to many of the roundtables and the community justice organizations and listening to how people were saying and organizing their concerns. And then after a while, we identified a bunch of them from a variety of different segments of society, um, advocates and business people and local government and police officers and educators. And we invited them all to go and see a play together. And then we watched the play and we did an analysis of the play. And they noticed how there's backstory and there's script, and that's constraining how people act. And then we said, well, what if we were considered ourselves to be a play? What is the backstory in the script that you get here that constrains how you can act and what you can and can't do and say here? And so we did a reverse mapping, we did a dominant story mapping and then a reverse mapping in that town, and we named some of these features. Now, out of that, one of the things that was a big deal was the relationship between the police, the movement for Black Lives, the Latin kings and queens, the city government, and some of the kind of middle class, mid-tier social justice advocates. Because the Latin kings and queens, the movement for Black Lives didn't really get along with or didn't relate very closely with the middle tier advocates, the kind of elitist social justice advocates, the business community, the local government, and the police. We got them all together and we asked a question over the course of 6 sessions. Well, after we did this, the question was, how can we create a community in which everyone feels safe, protected, and respected. Because those were the three dimensions in the dominant narrative,
Mhm.
in both the dominant narrative and the counter story, that seemed to be important. There was fear, there was disrespect, there was a lack of concern for our conditions. And so, how do we create uh, a community in which everybody feels safe, protected, and respected? Out of that, the police force took on implicit bias and started building up some restorative justice processes. They recreated a human services budget project that was a community budgeting process, as opposed to city council determining what the budget should be, so they have a different set of listening around a new narrative that they were creating and figuring out what are the ways to do that. And what they realized, what the police realized, was some of the things that had been embedded in their budget really should be human resources stuff. And so the police actually moved to reduce some of their funding so that they wouldn't get considered to be responsible, because they said it's not stuff we're trained for. All it does is cause us to fail. And every time we fail, it creates an increased sense of fear and disrespect. Don't ask us to do it. And so they gave back a bit of the money, so that went into the public service pool. And then they have a community budgeting process for that. And it's still an ongoing conversation and process, but it's 8 years in. They've been doing that kind of work and conversation and engagement, and they still get together from time to time. So they had a similar conversation after I had pulled out. They had a similar conversation with public service and the school system, and to address issues around what we colloquially call the school to prison pipeline, but how um, Black and brown bodied youth were being impacted by the presence of community resource officers in the schools and in these community centers, and how they could shift and change that narrative and change the relationships, resources, and structures, so that that was also a place where people could feel safe, protected, and respected, because the youth and the very young people hadn't been involved in the earlier conversation. So it's important to find a way to incorporate them. And so that process has been going on. That piece of it has been happening for about 4 or 5 years now.
And when you, so they created the story, the narrative with you, right? Did you
Yes.
invite them to offer a counter narrative, or did you look at the narrative and say, well, here's what a counter narrative would look like?
No. They have to be, it has to be their words. It has to be their articulation. So you always ask, you say, this is the dominant narrative. This is what you all have said is problematic in the community. This can't possibly be everything that's happening in the community, because I see what you all are up to. So what are some of the small, unique, sometimes overlooked things that are happening in community that aren't predicted by fear and apathy and misunderstanding, but in fact are counter to that? And so then they start saying, well, we do this and we do this. There was one really, I still think is one of the most touching and inventive ways of creating a space of safety in their community. One of the most senior police officers engaged with, there have been a rash of robberies for both documented and undocumented migrant workers, because they always get paid in cash on certain days, and they would get robbed walking home usually, and they would be afraid to call the police because certain police officers were going to cooperate with ICE and have them deported, and so they would have to sacrifice their pay, but they would like to be able to be related to the police. And the fact that they couldn't be related to the police and other people knew the story meant that other people who weren't impacted in that way also continued to increase their distrust of the police. One senior police officer said, this is what you do: call the police, refuse to speak in English. Don't try to speak in English when the dispatcher asks you, because what that then will require is the dispatcher to transfer you to the one dispatcher that speaks Spanish, who is going to dispatch officers who are actually going to respond to your concern. And so they did an intervention in the system until they could get the whole police force committed to safety, protection, and respect. And you could find this little intervention. You say, well, what makes that possible? You know, a certain kind of courage, a certain kind of love ethic, a certain, made that thing possible, even in the midst of this other. And so that's part of the counter narrative. And so you build that, and you build those out, those unique outcomes out, and then say, you all have to choose. You're making choices every day. You get to choose what you're going to live into.
I wonder if you ever hear a critique that
I hear critiques all the time. This may be a new one that you're going to give me, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily mine, but I imagine that a critique would be that by framing this as a choice, are you burdening people who are feeling oppression as a result of the dominant narrative?
Right. Well, it's a choice, but it's not their choice only. There are people who declare themselves, identify themselves to be people of goodwill, who, when they take a look, will notice that their reactions to the problematic are contributing to the problematic, right? And if you haven't unveiled it for them, then they can't see it, and they recognize that they have choices in it as well. The way that city council does public hearings, it shuts certain people off. It silences certain kinds of opinions. The way that police respond to certain kinds of cases, it silences certain voices. If they want to create spaces of integrity and trust and inclusion, then they have to recognize that their natural way of intervening is problematic, and they're responding to the problematic. They're afraid when they show up in these places, but their reaction to that fear increases the fear that others already have. And then that spiraling of fear increases distrust, increases the lack of success in their capacity to respond. And so they notice that they each have a contribution to the overall, because it's not that they are the problem, it's that they're reacting to the problem in ways that are sustaining and reproducing the thing that they otherwise wouldn't want to contribute to. It is a fact, though, that even those who are oppressed and marginalized often act in ways, having habituated themselves to the narrative and understanding the way that the systems work, they act in ways that sustain the problematic. I mean, they found a way to thrive in it or survive in it, but the way that they thrive and survive also sustains it. They have to at some point choose to be different. So it is a burden. And sometimes we don't want that. We want to just say, look, we've found an accommodation here. We're going to do it this way and live it out and hope that it changes. Great. Good to notice you've made a choice, and the choice doesn't require a substantial change. I think you'll be successful. Most people can be successful in maintaining the levels of oppression and marginalization that currently exist.
Yeah, and I feel like people who have managed to find a way to live with it want to sustain it because
right.
they figured, yeah.
Right, and I get that. I definitely get that. Yeah.
How do these processes get started?
Somebody does something like pick up a book and say, this seems fascinating. I'm going to try it. And then they call me, we walk through like, what are some of the early community engagement processes that you have to do, some of the early listening, small group listening and things like that. And then they pick it up and decide, here we go, we're going to run with it. And you convene some folks and start a conversation.
So
the process itself is really simple.
Yeah.
The theory and the power underneath it is actually really complex, but you don't need to know the depth of the theory in order to get the benefit of the process itself.
And so in the beginning, you're really, I mean, in this example you gave, one person picks up a book, calls you, and then you're on the phone, right? Or ringing
Right,
doorbells or
right.
something. No one's ringing doorbells now, but reaching out to folks in the community, trying to bring them into the fold, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Yeah.
get enough interest before you can really kick off this this process.
Process.
At first,
Yes.
starting with the conversations to develop this narrative. Okay.
Right, right.
All right. Well, we do have a question. I think it's a good one I want to ask you.
Okay.
So one of our participants is asking if you would give an example of working with a group that was not able to move forward. And if there is
Mm-hmm.
no example, it would also be interesting to hear of a case that was very difficult.
Well, so I would distinguish in the question not able to move forward and choosing not to move forward. Those are two very different things. To describe them as not able says it's actually impossible. I'm like the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. I believe in 6 impossible things before breakfast almost every morning, right? So I think it's possible. It's just that it becomes difficult for people to choose. Like right now, I'm working with a few different national Christian denominations. And one of the things that they're trying to figure out is how to uh, disconnect from the doctrine of discovery and the embedded whiteness in the theology that they have that has reproduced itself in terms of congregational structure, denominational leadership, access to resources, and so forth. They recognize there is a racial justice problem in the way that the denomination is manifesting publicly and trying to find a different way. And it will require a different understanding of scripture, a different understanding of God. And that's something they've got to sit with. And so I don't think that they have failed. I think that they're sitting with it. And I'd like to believe that sitting with the question for some time, that's why I say in that one slide, I say, give people time to sit with the choice. Because every major transformation begins with a loss. You can't transform anything without acknowledging that we have to lose something in order to get something else. And sometimes the loss is too significant for everyone to undertake. And so we would rather sit than to give up that thing. And that's good to notice. It's like, and that's really helpful because that becomes the choice. It's like we get to decide as an active agency that the transformation that we've talked about would require us to give up something that we're not willing to give up right now in this moment. That's really a powerful decision to make. And you want people to live with that and allow for that.
So I really appreciate your example of these national Christian denominations, especially being in South Carolina,
Yeah.
where the faith community is very, very strong here, and I imagine that asking people to change, to change their understanding of God would be extraordinarily difficult here.
Mm-hmm.
Have you? I mean, you said, for this particular group, people are sitting with it right now. Has anyone actually
Right.
taken the next step and said, okay, maybe we should rethink?
Well, I mean, some people are saying yes, and then because it's entangled with everything, because people's image, even though we think of these things as non-consequential, when you have artwork that creates God as an old white guy and Jesus as a young white guy, then whiteness becomes the proper hierarchy. And so then everything else should be beneath God. Everything else should be beneath the old white man, right? And so that's embedded in the way that we think and organize all of society. And you think about, like, David Rock is a neuropsychologist. I love David Rock. He has a methodology or a analytical framework he calls SCARF.
Mm-hmm.
SCARF, SCARF. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. With regard to status, when he does brain scans, a diminished status lights up the same parts of the brain as if you had a gun to your head, a knife to your throat, or you envision yourself driving off a cliff. There's a level of life-threatening precarity that is attached to diminished status. And the thing that he's followed up in his subsequent research, it's not you coming down, but somebody that you've built your identity around, them being lower than you, them coming up, even getting closer, if not equal, them coming up creates a life-threatening sense of precarity. And they react just that way. And so in the deep recesses of our minds, if our entire theology is kind of unconsciously based on this superiority,
Mm-hmm.
then, and everything else is within the hierarchy underneath that, then it is a really difficult, it entangles everything, because we have to retell history. We have to reimagine our legal structures. We have to reimagine the relationship between people and property in a capitalized slave economic system. We have to reimagine what that should look like. Everything changes with, it's not, it sounds like it's a simple, but it's a load-bearing wall to all of their identity in a way that will cause a substantial disruption of self. I get that it's hard to do. And it also means, once I've said that I no longer believe that, then I'm also saying that maybe my grandparents and my parents were liars. And that's really problematic. And so this isn't a light choice. This isn't a easy something to do. It is something that people ought to sit with for a while, because eventually, in order to make the choice, there's going to be some serious grieving, wailing, gnashing of teeth before we can find ourselves with a new identity to move into a space of equity. And so it's a process.
I find what's also interesting, and I don't know how this relates to what you said, but I think it does, is the when I've talked about and taught constitutional drafting in other countries, one of the topics that comes up is always whether and how far to push forward rights for people who may be been marginalized under prior regimes. And I feel like there's, and this is all coming from American authors, there's this description, right? This narrative about how rights were granted here that completely undermines what actually happened. And it comes out as something like this: well, we should just let it develop naturally when they're ready, just like when we were ready, we're like, everyone can have rights, as though a bunch of old white guys were sipping tea one day and we're like, you know what, let's give everybody rights. And I wonder if that kind of ties a little bit to what you've been saying about narratives.
Yeah, because that narrative, the narrative of it was a evolving, emerging, naturally occurring process, creates, okay, Michel Foucault, knowledge is the manifestation of power. People misquote him all the time because he writes knowledge / power. They think that what he's saying is knowledge is power.
Mm.
What he actually says is knowledge is the manifestation of power. Every interpretation of history that got passed down was based on a particular power regime,
Mhm.
and it was informed by a particular operation of power. And so this notion, the way that they tell this narrative of evolving, it kind of takes away some of the power that they otherwise are operating in, that actually produces and reproduces the repression that they say eventually just naturally dissolved, right? And they would like to believe that that happens all around the world, and it doesn't. But to tell a different interpretation, the way that indigenous and marginalized and other communities, the global majority, would tell the story, the way the global majority would talk about the story, would have to identify their role in the repressive order and maintaining a repressive order. And so they have to tell a different kind of story. So the exportation of kind of a neoliberal, piece with rights-based understanding, the way that we tell it, is definitely problematic and sustains a global order, a global capitalist order.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn to one of our questions from the audience who asks, so we do have a number of participants who work with survivors of domestic violence. And so this person is asking, do you have any recommendations or do you have any ideas of how you think this would work with individuals who have engaged in domestic violence?
So it's transformative community conferencing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not necessarily designed for individual engagement. It's designed for addressing the epicenter of the conflict more than the episode of the conflict, right? Like, what are the narrative foundations that make domestic violence in certain communities um, possible, probable, more likely to go unaddressed, obscured, like that. So while transformative justice may, in fact, Mimi Kim, Miriam Kaba's transformative justice model may work well for the individual episodes of domestic and inter-partner violence. What you also want to investigate is, what are the cultural narratives, the gender narratives, the race narratives, the economic narratives of property that allow the rule of thumb to still be embedded. The rule of thumb, that old British idea that you can't beat your wife in public with a rod larger than the circumference of your thumb. That idea, like where does that sit? Where does it sit in our police procedures? Where does it sit in our legal ordinances? Because that's the legacy and aftermath that allow that structure to be maintained over time. So dealing with it one episode at a time is important to show care to the people who are directly experiencing it. But you can't stop it one episode at a time. You've got to dig in the dirt to understand what are the cultural narratives and the structural forces that produce and reproduce those instances and allow them to go unaddressed or unaccounted.
It seems to me there would be several layers to this, right? So and again, thinking of South Carolina, which has very poor numbers when it comes to domestic violence, there's this sort of general question of why in this state is it such a problem? What is contributing towards it? But then I also think that if you start breaking down community into smaller segments, right? So if we start looking at those other identities, we might also ask, who do we have serving, people who are experiencing violence? Are they meeting the needs of the people, right, that they're supposed to be serving, or a particular subset. Like, what's the question, especially the racial and cultural dynamics around that as
Sure,
well?
sure.
It seems like there'd be quite a lot to do in this space.
There is quite a lot to do, which is why you have to identify the narrative,
Yeah.
because what happens in the legal, what happens in the social services, what happens in, what are they saying in the different faith communities, what are they saying in the business and economic communities, those are stories. The narrative that holds all those together is what you're trying to get, because if you begin to transform the narrative, then each of those stories loses its current logic, right? Like, they have a logic that exists within a particular narrative frame. And so that's why we're digging deeper to understand what the narrative is that makes each of those independent stories make some sense.
Have you worked with other faith communities
Other than,
other than the Christian denominations?
yes.
Has it been, have there been any like notable differences, or is it largely just the same approach?
Well, so knowledge is, so each faith community, people belong based on the narratives that they align with. And each faith community is based on a set of narratives and logic. So the processes of identifying the narratives and the logic are the same processes. Like, what actually comes of it is very different. The source of it, like, I spend time every year in India, in the Asia Plateau. And so I get a chance to work with folks who are deeply embedded in the casting system that has some of its, much of its articulation inside of Hinduism as a faith. And so, how do you begin to unpack all of that becomes really, really difficult, because the economic order and the social order and the political order and the educational order and the religious order are all they're carried even in the names that people have. The seams on their garments, everything tells the tale of who it is that you are, who it is that you're supposed to be, who it is that you're allowed to be, right? And so that's a really difficult thing to disturb. And the fact that, middle caste up, people may not want to disturb it. It's all, and the people who really want to disrupt it see themselves having less power and less capacity to disrupt it. And so it's one of those slow kind of threads. You pull, you pull, you pull at threads, and eventually that sweater is going to unravel. But it could take a while. It could take a couple of generations of unraveling to do it.
And at what point, so at some point you said earlier, right, when you were giving that Greensboro example, you had extricated yourself, right? And they were now continuing, right? So you'd set the top spinning and it's continuing to spin. So at what point in the process do you decide it's ready to go on without you as facilitator?
When it is ready to go on without you, you know that your work is done here, and it's like, this is good. And in certain communities, I extricate myself because I'm just not there. Once you've developed the leadership, it's really important that the people are doing their work, doing their own work. And so, in my job is always to work myself out of a job, except in the communities where I live, right? And so I'm always working to build leadership that can manage this and can keep it going and has the vision. And I'm still in constant conversation with folks. I'm just not there because it's really important for people to know, understand, believe, and actually operate from the place where they are defining, leading, owning, benefiting from, sustaining whatever change it is that whatever transformation it is that they're hoping to make. It's got to be theirs. And so, I don't want to pull out too soon, and I don't want to stay too long, right? So it's always, that's a delicate balancing act. in every part of community building, peace building, conflict transformation. As mediator, you can be in the middle of a conversation for a long time, but then at some point, you have to know how to sit back once you've created the conditions and sit back and allow the folks to work through their own stuff, especially if they're going to have to work together on an ongoing basis. You don't want them to always have to go through you to resolve stuff. And so in every conflict transformation, trauma healing process, at some point you have to have given enough space and energy for people to be able to, and you have to believe that people have the capacity to do their own work.
I had a couple of thoughts. Well, I guess I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to ask just a couple of questions. One, do you have like an ideal mix that you would want to see before moving forward with developing the narrative? And related to that question, when you're working in a place like Greensboro, how important is it to have government sign off in some way for you?
It's helpful to have government sign off. It's not essential. In Greensboro, over the course of time, part of what happened was 3 of the people that were working with us got elected to city council because they were working with a group of people who had articulated a narrative. And so they can go back to their communities and run on a platform that is the narrative of that counter story, right? One of the people who was working with us, who had been a young police officer over time, he was raised up. Eventually, when a new mayor came in, the new mayor said, I need you to direct the Office of Public Safety for the city because you understand what we're trying to do with the transformation of this community police relationship, and you have that counter narrative. Mm-hmm. And so over time, you have government. You may not have elected officials at the time that you start, but you have government if you have the people, because the people eventually they are the government, right? And so that's part of how you know that they are committed to it, because they can create that counter story, live into it, and invite others to believe in that platform and promote them to advance that particular platform. That's what they want. So that counter narrative, it becomes really powerful in that way. And you want to have people from as many different sectors and silos. Most of our communities, for a variety of different reasons, for policy reasons, for mostly because of intention, there are very few communities that are segregated just inadvertently, just sua sponte. Mm-hmm. Communities are segregated by intention, by policy, by architecture, by economic design, by intention. And so you need to have as many people from all of the different segments of society as you can, but you don't want, like, you can have, for different times, you can have a few hundred folks. For other times, you want to have a core group of folks that are representing a variety of different perspectives that can also, be constituents, not representative, but can be communicative constituents to a variety of segments of the group, of the society. So it's not a particular N+1 number, but it's representation in all of those, and not as proxy, because each person has multiple identities and roles. Small business owner who happens to be a woman of color, who happens to be a mother who happens to go to this public school, right? Has children in this public school, represents a variety of different things, but it's not like she's checking all those boxes. It's at different times in her life, different aspects of what's happening in community make certain roles or aspects of her identity more salient than others. And so she reacts out of her motherness. She reacts out of her small business owner nature. She reacts out of her community advocacy. She reacts as a woman of color, as a woman, and so all of those identities are there. And you try to have as much of that present as possible so that people can hear from one another about the real mix that makes up their community. One of the things that often happens is there are some people who are extremely resistant to the process of participating in transformation. And you only want to use so much energy in invitation for them to be involved. You leave the door open, but you can't let people who are utterly resistant to transformation be the ones that set the agenda or establish the time for discussing transformation. And so we will go, we will leave a door open. You are always welcome. And you may notice that if you haven't been here, you might be surprised when you see the change coming, but we're going to be building towards transformation.
So it seems to me this would have this could be applicable in a number of different sort of circumstances. And right now, thinking about groups who are thinking about who they've excluded for a very long time, especially in advocacy. So I'm thinking like reproductive rights versus reproductive justice, or the
climate change versus environmental justice.
Climate change versus environmental justice, or sort of anti-trafficking versus sex workers' rights. I think that there's just a lot of conversation that could really benefit from this approach.
Yes. Yeah. And so the hope is for full employment for me and everyone else who wants to be involved with transformative community conferencing. My real hope is, it's aspirational at this point, but I've been asked a number of times, and my hope is to do next summer at the end of the spring semester, to do a training workshop for people who are really interested in running these in a variety of organizational and community settings, because I do think you're right that this kind of conversation could be really helpful in a number of arenas where people have tended to silo and operate in marginalized ways, but the conversation requires all of them.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And however we can help you get that off the ground.
Great. All right.
All right. Well, it's 4:01. So okay. I'm going to have to close now. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful, and we learned a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Good. And to everyone, thank you so much for joining us for these 8 sessions. It's been really great. I will be sending out a survey sometime soon, so please keep an eye out for that and let us know what you think and what you'd like to see more of, and we will keep on working from our end too. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.